And we're live. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another Sales Hacker webinar. We got a special one today. We're joined by Kevin Warner from Leadium, and we're talking about data-driven outbound and how specifically you can implement a data-driven outbound acquisition strategy yourself. Kevin, welcome to the community. We're stoked to have you here.
Yes, thanks for having me back. I'm excited to be here.
Of course. I see everyone kind of trickling in now. I think now would be the most appropriate time to figure out who's with us today. As we let the room fill up, it kind of gives us a better understanding. If we get a feel for who's in the room with us, we can cater our conversation to be more relevant to why you showed up. If there's a bunch of like BDRs, SDRs, we can focus more on the like individual contributor, how to personalize your cold messaging, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas if all you guys are on like sales ops, we may take like a higher level discussion. So I'm going to launch a poll here. Please do let me know, what's your role? Seeing lots of BDRs, SDRs, not surprising, given we're talking about data-driven outbound. Also a lot of sales leadership. That is a little surprising. But I think this conversation is going to be super valuable. Kevin and I were discussing in our pre-webinar, I'm not going to give away the secrets quite yet, but I think your sales leaders, your frontline sales managers are going to find this conversation really valuable because Kevin has some tips and tricks up his sleeve on how to like implement a data-driven outbound strategy for your team, specifically so they aren't spending like hours personalizing every message, right? Okay, I'm going to end that. Look at that. About half of the room is BDRs, SDRs, 20% sales leadership or executive. That's pretty amazing. Some sales ops, sales enablement, and then of course our account executive folks who always join. Very cool. Okay, guys, I think the room is filling up. It's always like kind of like popcorn. Like I want to just kind of like ramble on until we get enough people in the room where we can actually begin the conversation. Yes. And whenever there's like 2 to 3 seconds between each person joining, I think it's time to start. Okay, some housekeeping items before we dive in. Inevitably, on every webinar, we get a few questions. Is this recorded? Are you going to send me the recording? Yes, we will send you the recording within about 24 hours after the webinar. So if you got to jump, I know an hour is a big investment of time. We're living in this new like remote world. You probably got kids in the background. You got dogs in the background. Take care of your business. No worries. We'll send you the recording. Also, we do these for the community. Kevin and I have a great conversation lined up, lots of talking points. It's going to be really valuable, but we want to do this for you. So if you have questions along the way, look at the bottom of your screen right now. You're going to see a Q&A box. Open that up. Whenever you have a question, drop it in the box. And Ginny from Leadium on the back end, you can't see her, but she's here. She's smiling. Ginny and I will monitor the Q&A. We'll forward the questions to Kevin. Kevin's a boss when it comes to outbound strategy and tactics. So he's going to be able to answer all your questions. Drop them in the Q&A. In the meantime, let us know where you're joining from in the chat. I'm joining from beautiful Portland, Oregon. We recently had like the entire state on fire, but we had thunderstorms roll through the past few days. So we're doing way better. The smoke is gone. We're doing okay. I believe, Kevin, you're in like the Dominican Republic?
I am in our Santo Domingo headquarters. Yes, the Dominican Republic.
Boom. Got the international crew joining us today. Where's everyone joining from? Denver, Colorado, Toronto, Canada. Welcome, Camila. Chloe from Argentina. Gabrielle from Montreal. Matt from the UK. Abby from Washington. Sky from Boston. Austria. I'm not going to try to pronounce your first name. I'm sorry. Oh man, hi Alex, just joining you from Spain, Philadelphia, Berkeley, India. Look at this. We got people from all over the world. We're rocking it. Okay, I think we're ready to dive into this. And I'm going to kick it off with a bit of controversy. Kevin and I had a pre-webinar, and Kevin has some interesting and I think really valid points about some of this stuff that we're hearing in the B2B sales space. We're all getting flooded, right? Especially now that all these companies are moving to the virtual world, creating a bunch of content. we're getting flooded with strategies and tactics and how to do this and how to do that. And no one is more flooded than BDRs, SDRs, frontline sales managers when it comes to outbound strategies and tactics. Like, what should our first touch be? Should it be a phone call and email? Is cold calling actually dead? Is it not dead? Should we personalize, or is it all about relevancy? Should we personalize at scale? If so, how do we do that? There's just so much noise, and it's really hard to figure out what we should actually do. And that's why Kevin's here today. He has an interesting point of view on personalization and relevancy in your outbound campaigns. But first, let's talk about, Kevin, all this noise that we're hearing in the B2B sales space and kind of where that's coming from. Why are we getting bombarded all of a sudden with all these what we should do's and shouldn't do's?
Yeah, the noise to me is incredibly interesting. One, when we started 7 years ago, SDRs, outbound, it was such a quick growing kind of role and business operation within an organization. Outreach was just in its infancy in a different type of product line, and it was just making a shift. And so what you've seen over kind of the last 5 to 7 years is more and more leaders in the space who have gained the experience from those early days and kind of built upon it. It's good and bad. So it's good for SDRs because you're kind of learning from those who already gained that experience. You're kind of learning from different swaths of industries and product groups, and you can really take from that. The bad from that side, if you're an SDR, is not applying a level of context. And I think our thought leaders in the space are more doing it for self-promotion. That's the sad part of it, because oftentimes it's just glamorizing statistics or glamorizing what worked for them without adding a layer of context and kind of thought-provoking, ideas about how they got there, what they tested, what market they're testing it into, how they shifted for this or that. And if you're an untrained SDR, you might just say, hey, why am I not getting that open rate or that response rate, since all thought leaders are saying we need to do this or we need to do that. It's the layer of context that's the most frustrating. Because if you do this for a lot of companies, if you do outbound and you do sales development for a lot of products, markets, industries, segments, geographies, what you learn is nobody is held equal. Very similar to, if Sales Hacker had a competitor come along that has no name recognition, no marketing budget, they can't apply the same strategies and logic that current day Sales Hacker is doing for their own growth, because it's just a completely different market or stage or kind of growth period. It's that layer of context that's often forgotten in the LinkedIn posts or the conversations. It's a lot of kind of self-glorifying, look how amazing we are, and why aren't you doing this? Which, on an SDR perspective, it can be, why am I not performing like that? What should I be doing more? From a business operations standpoint, your SDR kind of leaders or your sales development leaders might say, hey, why are we underperforming? We have a team of 10 SDRs. I see that these people are all saying that we should be doing X, Y, and Z, and that's going to bring the conversions. If we use physical gifting, if we just cold call more people, if the sequences are longer, if we do more A/B testing, that should just drive conversions. These people are saying it's truth, but you're missing that level of context, which is the most frustrating part of thought leadership in the industry today.
It's essentially people sharing their successes with outbound without filling you in on the entire journey they took to get there. Yeah.
Right. And it's that journey that's most important, because if one person has experience at a single organization, you really don't know that much about outbound, because all products, all markets, all geographies, all personas are completely different. Even if you're targeting the same personas, VPs of sales, are you targeting them with a Slack competitor, or are you targeting them with a revenue driving, business software? You're not going to get the same conversions. You're not going to get the same responses. The strategies are going to be inherently different. Conversion rates will be incredibly different. So even your own experience is missing a level of context that you just don't know. So I don't fault leaders, because they can only talk to kind of what they've done and kind of how they're doing it. But I think the conversation needs to be more kind of embracing to the context of how we did it and how it applies to us. By the way, this won't apply to everybody, but the underlying principles of testing, of understanding your market more, is what you should be focused on. And this is what happens when you take that more strategic approach.
That's what we're going to talk about today, right?
Yes.
Like how to ignore the advice that you're getting. It's kind of ironic coming from me working at Sales Hacker, which is essentially a media publication in the sales space. We produce a lot of content on how to do things and how not to do things. But we always get questions, and this resonates really strongly with me because we always get questions on our webinars, on our blog posts, within the community of like, when's the best time to send an email? How should I start my sequences? What should my cold call script look like? And the answer is the ever frustrating, it depends, because it really does depend on the context, right? Who are you selling to? What problems are they facing? How does your solution fit within their workflow? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So, and that's what we're going to cover today, how we can do that, right, Kevin?
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's the unfortunate. Everyone wants to know what subject line should I use, and HubSpot listed the top 10 subject lines that they have, but what works for HubSpot is very different than what works for a brand new startup. I think the underlying principle is there is no answer, right? There is no answer to how can I get this performance or that. There's nothing that you can take from one experience and apply to the next. The answer is you have to constantly test. It is fundamentally, Outbound is an acquisition channel, and it should be treated as one. Not unlike Facebook marketing is what I relate it to most often. And that's what works for you today won't work for you in 3 months because the market changed. If you're targeting higher education, you have different timings that you might have more successful campaigns and lower conversion rates based on the school year and when their buying cycles are. Global events might occur and your conversion rates completely change. And you have all of these variables and you have to understand this is an acquisition channel. There is no constant. It's a consistent launch, test, apply changes, launch, test, apply changes, just like you would do with a Facebook ad. What works today on a Facebook ad won't work for them a month from now, but they've already switched it out with 5 new ads that they're testing. They'll shut off 4 of them, go with the one that works, and then redo the whole process. And that's what modern outbound should be functioning as within every organization.
So forget always be closing, always be testing, ABT.
Right.
That should be, okay. And, I almost don't want to say this because we partner so closely with B2B SaaS companies specifically, but a lot of this noise coming to B2B sales is coming from B2B SaaS, mainly because the industry just produces so much content, right? They really get that content marketing model of like going very top of funnel, producing a bunch of content that's relevant to B2B salespeople. And in the process, they're guilty of contributing to a lot of this noise that we're seeing in the space right now. On our pre-webinar call, we had a really interesting discussion on 2 different types of SDRs. And we started the conversation with these, you call them strategy-based SDRs, right? And this is the model that SaaS companies are taking. Can we talk a little bit about what strategy-based SDRs are?
Yeah, before we get into strategy-based, the concept and kind of how I built it out in our organization is to understand that not all employees are equal, right? Not everybody has the same motivations. Not everyone wants to be rich. Some want to be comfortable. Not everything's monetarily driven. Some might be culture driven, which is why you're trying to conquer this within a business operation so that you can kind of tend to what motivates people. And if you can understand what motivates an employee quicker, the more successful you can be because you can put them in positions where they can succeed for what you need them to do. So understanding that not all people have the same motivations and not all people want to grow at the same rate, you have to understand that not all SDRs are equal as well. And the way we've broken it down is you kind of have the industry growing in kind of 2 parallel roles within sales development. And one is a strategy-based SDR, and the other is an impression-based SDR. And both are good and needed within an organization. And the idea is that you're specializing, even within the SDR role, you're specializing 2 different types of SDRs because they're going to give different organizations different benefits. And it all backs into this is an acquisition channel. Inherently, the goal of an acquisition channel is to get in front of more of your demographic, more of your decision makers, more of your ideal customer profile. So there is always an impressions game within any acquisition channel. Strategy-based SDRs is really the one you hear most about, and it's because it's kind of perpetuated by the SaaS industry. And that's sadly a lot of times thought leaders, especially in sales development, who are getting the most attention on things like LinkedIn or even like Sales Hacker, etc., because it's a different business model, even though it represents the minority of businesses in the world. The majority of businesses in the world need to be profitable in every deal they sign. Profit and underlying growth is driven by not a 10x multiplier or a hopeful IPO or a $20 million capital raise. It's your small businesses, your mid-market businesses who are looking at everything from how much revenue did we gain from that? And that's just the reality of the majority of businesses, but it doesn't get any focus. So SaaS is perpetuating the strategy-based SDRs, which is, hyper-touch, hyper-personalized, multiple channels, calling, email, phone, LinkedIn, done all personalized, having very few automated steps, gifting. Companies like Sendoso are growing like wildfire because of kind of this strategy-based SDR role, where it's how do we integrate gifting into it? And the whole concept behind that is good because you do need a strategy-based SDR. You need to understand what are they doing, how is it working, how is it not working? You need to own that internally within your organization. So you need to pay the HR and the training costs. So that person is getting kind of a well-rounded kind of experience and knowledge gain as well, which is inherently more costly for an organization. One, to do calling plus email plus gifting, to spend the time to train them, to spend the time to understand how the channel works and gain that education. Inherently, you're willing to invest all of that because you want them to grow within your organization as well. You want them to become AEs. You want them to become your sales development leader. You want to put them in positions to continue to grow, where the majority of businesses in the world would say, no, we need you to do this function. And we don't have the next step for you because we're not trying to grow 10x or IPO. We just need to do X. So that's kind of this idea of strategy-based SDRs, and that's kind of the focus of it, is kind of the heart of all SDR functions. Write your own copy. Understand the analytics of what's working and what's not working. Try different channels. Call. If you have free time, start calling. But it just costs more. Your cost per lead kind of increases exponentially, which just isn't feasible for the majority of businesses. However, that component is still super important, that somebody's understanding the strategy part of sales development.
So if I'm an SMB sales leader, sales manager, and I know that I can't afford a super high customer acquisition cost, right? Let's say my deal size is just too low, right? I can't afford to have a whole team of strategy-based SDRs. There's an alternative, which I think is what the bulk of this webinar is going to be about. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, the next SDR role, which we see is kind of more and more kind of growing, is kind of an impressions-based SDR. And this is the idea that you need impressions with your messaging, with your value propositions in front of your kind of customers. You don't need an individual focused on the why. Why are you using this message? Why are you using this strategy? At what point are you changing the A/B test because this one's not working or this one is working? You just want somebody to manage the engagements, make sure that send outs are going out, responses are being handled, phone calls are being made, LinkedIn messages are being made, and there's somebody executing that workflow. And the idea with the impression-based SDR is, one, they're usually a little bit more affordable. You understand that their growth might be idealistically different, right? So this is where 7 years ago, where I met my co-founder Sergey, and we kind of said, wait a second, the global market tends itself perfectly to impression-based SDRs. And the idea is you can't lose strategy, but not every organization needs multiple strategy-based SDRs. You need one person to determine what the strategy is, what the content is, what the messaging is, what the scripting is, what the coaching is, what the analytics mean, when you should start and stop something, when you should change it. You need somebody within your organization doing that, but you don't necessarily need 5 of them doing it. One person might be able to work alongside a pod of impression-based SDRs who are then executing on the strategy. And then you're kind of continually refining it. And again, I hearken it back to most acquisition channels. If you think about Facebook ads, the same person who's making a graphic is not the same person who's writing the byline, who's not the same person that's looking at the analytics and determining when it's underperforming Your CTAs aren't there, your impressions aren't there, your click-throughs to acquisition or a shopping cart aren't there. We need to turn this off. Those are different roles, but all coming together very importantly. The difference is most organizations can't afford multiple SDRs or a VP of sales development and a sales development director and an SDR. It's just unfathomable to spend that much, which at the same time, not knowing how much profit will return, because the unknown is always how many appointments will we get?
Just to recap, two types of SDRs: strategy-based, which is the typical B2B SaaS sales development rep. You're writing all your own copy, you're coming up with your own sequences, you're trying to make a multi-channel, you usually get paid a bit more. Your company invests maybe a little bit more in like professional development because they want to grow you within the role to maybe an account executive or leadership or management. And then you have it's almost an entirely different team structure, right? Where you have a pod structure with a strategist and then impression-based SDRs under them that are more like execution focused. Like they have their sequences, they log into Outreach or whatever sales engagement platform you're using, and they know what they're doing, right? They know what they have to do today.
And one of the big problems is strategy-based SDRs or even the strategy-based sales development leader are few and far between, because too many organizations are focusing on just impressions. We just need X amount of conversions, just make them happen. And you don't have enough strategy component into it. And that's where the problem aligns. If you're an organization and you're trying to save money, you can't just get an impression-based SDR. You have to have some sort of strategy behind it. Too many organizations let every SDR create their own message. There's not one single hand on what are we testing? What's the purpose of this sequence? What's the messaging within the sequence? At what point, once it's opened or seen by how many people, do we determine it's not effective messaging or it is effective messaging? What are we testing within each email? There's just not enough of that. And a lot of organizations tell their SDRs, you need this quota, go get it. And that's where I sit back and laugh, because in our organization, that's an easy selling point for us, because we have a team of strategists, we have a team of data people, we have a specific sequence writing team. And the idea is, and it's going to get to the next part of the conversation, which is your SDRs, especially early strategy-based SDRs and impression-based SDRs, their goal is to hit quota, not a high conversion rate, right? You can hit 30 appointments all day if you log into ZoomInfo and have an unlimited data plan and I just pump in 5,000 contacts. But you should be looking at the conversion rate, because again, it's an acquisition channel. And that's sadly the messages and the emails you get in your inbox, which are not that personalized. They have bullet points. It's easily a selling email. You can see that it's a bad message. And that's more and more what's prevalent in the space. It's because you're not finding the mix between how do we have impression-based SDRs, but also how do we have strategy behind it?
Right. So that makes a lot of sense. I want to get a good feel before we move on to the next part of the conversation, which is going to be how we're getting a little bit deeper in the weeds on how to actually like implement a strategy like this, right? How do you create relevant cold messaging at scale without necessarily having a strategy-based SDR team, right? Spending hours and hours doing a bunch of research. Before we do that, I want to launch a poll. I want to get a better understanding of who in the room today is creating their own sequences and how much time they're spending right now personalizing their messaging. So if you all wouldn't mind giving us a little info, we want to know how you're handling this right now. Are you creating your own sequences? And if you are, or even if you're not, how much time are you spending personalizing each of your cold, in this case, emails?
That's my fear as those numbers come in.
They can't see the results yet, but
yes,
it is drastic. It is drastic. Okay, I'm going to close this in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Look at that. 88% of everyone in the room today is creating their own sequences.
Let me just add a little context to that. So at Ledium, I know I'm going to be a little self-promoting. In the space that we're playing in with outsourced sales development and an outsourced sales development agency, we're one of the big three, if you were to think of it in financial terms. It's just the reality of it. And even with being one of the big three, the one role over the last 5 years that I've never been able to hire for and still have high quality, make it a profitable role, etc., is sequence writing. Every client that we sign today, the sequences are 70% written by me personally. It's impossible to scale my company. I understand that. It's very difficult. But that's the problem, is because so much strategy and how do I personalize it with not personalizing it has to go into it. It is the most difficult aspect of outbound is the email, if you're doing email, is the call script, if you're doing call script, is LinkedIn, if you're doing LinkedIn, and how they all come together. It is quintessentially the most difficult thing of outbound. If you do it right, it almost doesn't matter who's behind the scenes. And that's where the impression-based SDRs come in. It doesn't necessarily matter who's running it. Same with that Facebook ad, right? Would any early marketer say, hey, you're responsible for coming up with the graphic for Nike, and you're responsible for the byline and the call to action. All marketers create your own, Facebook ads. No, you have a team that has a lot of experience who's all coming together to figure out what that is. And so that's what I know we'll get to in a second on how do you kind of start to customize it and start to learn from there. But just a little context and why that's a little alarming, but is why I would say is so prevalent in the space, and why a lot of times SDRs get bad kind of context put on them, is because you're not getting enough direction on how to write better sequences.
Yeah. Oh, let's give it to him, Kevin. We're getting some comments in the chat of creating your own cadences takes a good amount of time. Yes, it does. We saw, I think like 10% of the people on the webinar today are saying that it takes 20 plus minutes per personalized email. That's a lot of time. That's going to be really expensive. Kamala, no worries. She's got to jump. She says, thanks for the great webinar. Can't wait to see the recording. We're just about to get into the good stuff, Kamala, but we are recording it, and we will send it your way. And Megan wants to dive right into the next section of how do we actually send relevant messaging at scale, right? How do we make it valuable at scale without being a strategy-based SDR?
And it's a lot easier than you think. And I know testing and optimization sucks, but it's a lot easier to get the initial starting point than you think. And let me tell you, it takes that long. I've done this for 7 years. We've worked with about 500 different companies running multiple sequence per. It's still today to write a 6 to 7 step sequence that isn't hyper-personalized, and we'll get to how you can personalize without hyper-personalizing. It takes me about 4 to 5 hours. Even me, in my position, and 6 of those emails, you gotta remember, 1 email is just a goodbye email that's kind of utilized with small edits. It just takes that long, and you can't cheat that system, and if you try to, then they're gonna read through it. But let's get through how do you personalize without necessarily trying to over-personalize, or how do you still send it en masse? How do you conquer impression-based while still personalizing? One is you have to start with who are you targeting? So and that's kind of the understanding of who is my ideal customer? And you got to understand your ideal customer on a couple standpoints. One is, who are they just as individuals? If you are inherently targeting a CEO, you can get away with putting 14 words in an email. No more, no less, because bottom of the line is, if I'm not dealing with that problem today, very unlikely you'll get a yes or a no, right? If I do have that problem, if this is my first year as a business owner and I started my company 7 months ago and it's February, there's a good chance I don't have an accountant. And it's February and it's coming up to business tax time. You can be very short. If I have that problem, I'm incentivized to respond to you. Also understand industry, right? So one is persona and then the next is industry. If you're reaching out to medical HR, healthcare HR, it's going to be an uphill battle, right? These are people who just don't care. If it's not broke, don't fix it. Don't talk to people outside my network. It's going to be, you're going to have a fun time. If you're dealing with a tech SaaS startup who, is doing XYZ, it's going to be a little bit different, a little more conversational kind of talk. If you're reaching out to Deloitte, it's going to be much more professional, especially overseas, right? And you learn this very quickly if your ICP includes, Germany as an example. You don't start an email with hi or hello. That's familiar with you in the US. You say dear last name. And if you don't do it like that, it's right out the gate. Understanding your ICP is inherently the most expensive step to everything. Also, putting yourself in their position. And the easiest thing I always say when you're starting to kind of create sequences, and again, this is pre-testing. This is just how do I start with the initial sequence that we can then start to test. You have to make a lot of assumptions. And the best assumptions are made when you put yourself and you say, why do they care? I get it. You're a business owner. You created an awesome product, right? And it's amazing and your mom loves it. But at the end of the day, why do people care? What's going to get them to respond and say, yes, this is amazing. We need this. And you have to think in that context. And if you can put yourself in who you're targeting's mind, you'll start to kind of edit the language. But here's the most important thing as you start to write tests or sequences and then you start to test them. Don't be an SDR. Don't sell. Just be a human. And personalization a lot of times is getting too much noise with personalize it based on the job that they just moved to. Personalize it based on, their college experience. And I know it's less of that now. I'm just using that as an example. But personalize it on something that's so incredibly relevant to them that it took you time to find it. Zoom Info says, hey, we have 400 different data profile items you can tie in. Hey, we know that your latest site traffic was 2 million and you sold and you raised this revenue. That's not effective anymore. And it's not effective anymore because people are too familiar with Outbound. It's become too used of an acquisition channel for them to understand that. What's most effective today is just sounding like a human. It's so true. That's the only personalization we do is sound like a human and then personalize it based on their segment or their geography. You don't need to tie in anything else. You don't need to customize the messaging with anything. What I mean by that is when you reach out to automotive companies, you cite relevant automotive companies. You're grouping your prospects before you start them into a sequence, and that sequence is specific to that segment. Geography is the easiest one. If you're based in LA and you're not doing a localized sequence where the only thing you're personalizing is, hey, Alex, I see you're based in LA. Our company's actually based in LA. We're trying to do more, outreach to our localized community. We're just trying to grow here. Sometimes just so we can grab a Starbucks down the street. I see you guys are located on XYZ. And again, for your prospect, it comes across as, oh, this is super personalized because, yeah, it does. I see the question from Chris. Chris, you would be amazed how it works because Alex gets 15 emails a day. The one that sounded just like a person is the one he'll respond to. Now, you still need to remember that if Alex doesn't have a problem that you're solving for, he's still not going to respond. And that's where the impressions game still comes into it. You're not trying to swing for the fences in every email as well. So a lot of SDRs right now say, hey, days from now 2, days from now 3. Do you want to meet on Tuesday at 9? Thursday at 2, and that's in every single email. And we actually very rarely involve that in any more emails because that's the equivalent of swinging for a home run every single time you're at bat. And the reality is it's a strategic game. Sometimes you just need the bunt. You need to start a conversation. You just need Alex to respond to you because if he can respond to you, you got his attention. Now you can follow up and start that conversation a little bit more. It's very rare that Alex is going to be like, oh yeah, perfect. Send me the contract too before we even jump on the first time. This is an amazing opportunity. Not to say that you don't use, Tuesday at 9, but you don't put it in every message. Because again, you don't want to come across as the car salesman, which is the sad part of where Outbound has been right now, is more car salesman than, hey, there's an inherent need I think you have for your business. This is why I'm reaching out to you. If you don't think it's relevant, just let me know. Because they know you're selling to them. So don't overtly, try to make them seem like they don't know that and start bullet pointing features or lists, etc. The next really important thing to think about when you're creating a sequence is a prospect will, the majority of the time, if I want to make up a statistic, I'll just say 90% of the time, always click onto your company website before they agree to a meeting. Which means you don't need to sell. You're just kind of stoking the interest. Your website and your company website, now if it's a bad website, your conversion rates are going to be low completely because it's not doing you any good when you send them there. They're not learning anything. They're not gaining any value from it. So of course, just an email isn't going to win that over, which is where marketing and sales kind of have to come together, and a marketing funnel has to be great, and you need to kind of continue that conversation via the web experience. But knowing that they're going to go to the website before they agree, and you can test it. And I know that at the beginning of this, there were business leaders here. If you're not monitoring site traffic based on outbound, then you're already losing a little bit of a game. And what I mean by that is, look, if we work with a small business, they might say we get 300, visits a month. But as soon as we started outbound, because we're prospecting to X amount, our site traffic per month actually went to 1,200. But our website doesn't have anything on it because we'd never gotten traffic from it before. So you should actually be monitoring how much traffic outbound itself is driving to the site, because marketing does it all the time. They get paid by how many people are hitting their site funnel. And at the end of the day, if there's a drop off in conversions from traffic you're driving to the website based on outbound services, marketing should be called into the room for underperformance, not the sales development rep, because there's something potentially wrong on the website as well. And that's where the conversation needs to kind of be a more robust one between departments too.
So I want to hone in on a couple of things you said, but before we do, Chris has an interesting question here. Do you suggest a specific landing page for each sequence?
Not for each sequence, because again, the purpose of each sequence would be how are you kind of creating each sequence. You might have a different sequence for 5 different market segments where the only thing you change is one word. Hey, we work with automotive companies, or hey, we work with medical companies. That might be the only word you change within a sequence, but the reason I say you would run those as separate sequences is because you as an SDR or you as a business leader, you inherently want to know, for this acquisition channel, which part of my market segments actually convert through it. Because the reality is outbound doesn't work for all products, for all companies, for all market segments. It just doesn't. And so you want to learn, hey, outbound is a great channel for, medical. The people are opening it, they're responding. We've learned that the more likely to respond if they're VPs of marketing versus marketing managers who only account for 5%. So that data is actually being driven. And if you don't kind of segment it by sequences, you're not learning from it. And that's kind of that data aspect is, are you doing everything strategically so that you're not only driving conversions, but you're also seeing who can we drive more conversions with, or who's more successful, et cetera. To your point, specific landing pages for each sequence, if it's done well, if it's specific, sure, it won't hurt. It definitely won't hurt. The good thing with a landing page specific for each sequence is a landing page inherently has a single funnel, right? There's a purpose of that landing page to get you to the conversion funnel, which then you can see how many more people are more likely to always reply via a contact us form versus responding to you in an email. Because with outbound, and why it's a little bit of an impressions game, not everybody's going to reply on email, LinkedIn, or phone, right? If you were to call me, and I do this for a living, I will never answer your phone. Google has a Google screening feature. I won't even talk to you. If you send me an email, I'll see it and reply.
And that's right, Chris. Yeah, he's saying you should see a lift from your outbound sales campaigns on your site. Not necessarily you should send them to a specific landing page.
Right. Now, if you send them to a specific landing page, even better. And again, that goes to a lot. You don't need to add links to your outbound emails either, right? Sometimes you see, here's case studies, here's a link to the website, etc. Most people are smart now where if Alex sends me from Sales Hacker an email, I can see it was Alex from Sales Hacker. He has a link in his signature already. If I want to learn more, I have the channel to learn more. You don't even need to put it into your email. And I always say, because we get a lot of clients who say, hey, we have automotive or we have medical case studies. Can you attach those to the messages? No, you don't really need them. Again, the goal is just that would be the second step. Once they start the conversation, I can then use that and supply it. If you're providing that in your initial emails, you're really putting all the onus on your prospect. Hey, not only open my email and read it, but now click on these 3 links I sent you. And by the way, those are 3-page case studies. So now take more time to read a 2-page case study when really the email got you that goal already. If you weren't able to do it with 3 sentences, then that extra material isn't going to help. It's only going to hurt because now it comes across as more sales versus, specific conversation starter.
You covered a lot of really great stuff there. I think one of the key points was personalization for the sake of personalization is like well and truly dead. Like you shouldn't be personalizing your cold messaging just to personalize it. It needs to be relevant, right? And the only way to be relevant is to have a really solid understanding of your ideal customer profile, your buyer personas, and the problem that you're solving, right?
And exactly, and I know you're trying to push it along, but one aspect to that is even if it is important and you need to run it as an organization, I'm saying that there's 100 things to test when it comes to outbound. There's a lot of variables to this acquisition channel. There's 100 different things to test. You can't test them all because then you don't learn anything until a year later or 2 years later when you get enough impressions on each kind of sequence. So the key to it is understand, what are we doing? Why are we doing it? And what tests are we running? One test, easy test is, hey, super hyper personalized, spend tons of time to custom the messages, attach screenshots, videos, write on a whiteboard that message. If we want to use things like connect and sell, right, to power dialing, connect and sell costs money, guys. So if you're testing it, test that against a well put together, personalized based on segment or industry, impression-based campaign, and say, hey, even if the impression-based campaign got 5 less appointments that month, that appointment only costs $200 instead of $1,000. So as a business, what's better for you? Because some businesses would say, we're fine paying the $1,000 and the conversion rate was a little bit higher, that's perfect. A majority would say, hey, the lower the cost, the better.
Love it. Okay, so let's say I'm setting up my first sequence. I have a solid understanding of my ICP, my buyer personas, the problems they're facing. I created a pretty crispy value proposition. I'm feeling pretty good about it. Whatever, I set up a 5-6 step sequence, including, the first touch is email, followed by a ringless voicemail, social touch, another email, another phone call, let's say, right? To your point, that first sequence is fraught with assumptions. There's assumptions everywhere, right? What are some high impact variables that we can test? Like I know there's like micro optimizations that we can test. Like should my CTA be book a time here, or should it be, let's get a coffee, right? That may be like a micro test that you can run. Are there any like really high impactful tests that we can run?
Yeah, the highest impactful are the least valuable for the individual SDR, sadly, but the most valuable for a business in itself. And these are the easiest ones to test, especially on initial assumptions. And that's segments, so market segments. Yes, you have your ICP, but in that theory, let's just theorize you have 5 different industries you're targeting. Great. Well, the easiest test is if we're reaching out to all 5 industries, the value proposition for our organization does not change. Whether we deal with X industry or Y industry, the value proposition stays constant. So we can make the same assumptions there. However, what you might find out is one industry books 3-to-1 appointments versus another one. And so again, it's an acquisition channel. That is a variable that just might stand true. Some industries might be more antiquated. Some might be more open to change, whatever that purpose is. But that's an easy thing to test that you actually are doing today. But if you don't set it up properly, or you tag sequences properly or prospects properly, you're just losing that data. The next is persona. So the question is, are you targeting a single persona or do you have multiple personas? I would say the majority of organizations are dealing with multiple personas because you simply don't know who the decision maker is from one company to the next. If it's the VP of sales or if it's the sales manager or the sales development director. It could be one of those 3 people who start the conversation. Because of that, you're inherently targeting all 3. Now, if you have this dialed in, you might know which one specific person via outbound is going to have the highest conversion rate. And if that instance is correct, then you can scrap this test. But if you're reaching out to multiple personas, you're testing that already without making any changes. Now, you need to tag your sequences properly or tag your prospects properly so you can see the data separated inside of a platform like Outreach or SalesLoft, etc. But you're already testing those. So just start with, hey, you already have data coming back that most teams just kind of ignore, or they didn't set up the sequences properly, so they can't see that data, and it's going to take too long to kind of figure it out. And the next ones are, the easiest next ones are just do an A/B variation and change one thing. Make the call to action bold versus not bold. You know, say weekdays from now too, or say, how about today or tomorrow? Those are the micro things you can start to test as well. So you got a little bit of macro and micro that are incredibly easy items to A/B test that you're already doing, and it takes 2 seconds more.
Love it. We just had a really good question come in from Sky Synad. He's wondering how you triage, tier, or bucket contacts or accounts to prioritize them for outreach.
No, that's a great question. So Leadium's unique in that we have 150 data researchers. So we actually spend a lot of time on prospect researching, grouping them into ICPs, tagging them for specific sequences while they're still in spreadsheet form before we kind of upload them into an outbound kind of sequence for that reason. And bucketing comes down to what you as an organization wants to test the most, or what you've built your sequencing messaging around. And a lot of times, and I hate to do this answer, but there really is no one specific answer. And I'll go backtrack a little bit. You might say, hey, for each the 5 market segments that we go after, we actually have a unique value proposition. If you're medical, you actually care about our HIPAA policies that we have integrated into the platform. If you're automotive, you actually care more about this or that. So you're actually going to start to group your prospects via segment so that you give them unique messaging. Not that it has to be super hyper personalized, it just has to be relevant to that individual. And it seems so basic, but a lot of people don't. They just, through automation, I can just upload, start into sequence and go. That you're not kind of dividing it on that aspect. So those are, you got to just understand, hey, what's our sequence strategy? What are we trying to test? If your logic goes, hey, we don't necessarily, conversions are going to happen, right? Send more emails, make more calls, conversions will happen. It doesn't matter what message you use. It just, your conversion rate will drop to 0. So knowing that appointments will always come or conversions will always come, let's start with, well, what do we want to learn or test or get better at? Let's build it for that. And then once we launch it, we can continue to iterate it. And that's when you start to segment your prospects. I would say for us, the easiest ones are segment. So industry segment, not enough for just industry as well, because within a single industry, you might have 2 different segments. SaaS is a huge industry. Software is a huge industry. Is it real estate software or is it pet sitting software? Again, you can, if you can segment it, you can sub-segment it. Geography is a really good one, right? Because you can build personalized messaging just by putting, hey, I was just in Miami last week, and it doesn't need to be true. Hey, I was just in Vegas last month at a conference before they shut down. It would have been great to be able to meet there, but we just weren't able to. So maybe on my next trip, all right? And you just send all Vegas contacts that sequence. So it just all comes to how you want to segment it, but you should be segmenting your prospects before uploading them into your prospecting tool.
A hot tip right there. Yeah, doing that foundational work that'll allow you to create relevancy at scale without painstakingly personalizing every message.
Right. And on that last point, what that allows you to do, and as SDRs, you should be fueled with this type of conversation, because if you take to it and your SDR manager says, hey, you booked 15 appointments instead of 20, you flip it back to them and say, yeah, but you were having me reach out to an industry that's converting at a lower rate than Sam, who's reaching out to an on-fire industry because XYZ or whatever it might be. And by the way, even though I underperformed on conversions, we actually learned that this decision maker is the wrong type of decision maker through the process. And what that leads itself back to is outbound is inherently driving market value fit as well. Is there a market for this product targeting this kind of ICP or this market segment or this persona? Do we even have a product market fit? it would be unbelievable. And I would even say outreach itself as a platform or SalesLoft or whatever platform you're using for sales engagement would say, hey, there's some sub-segments of industries that have sales teams and they will just never switch off of this antiquated homegrown product for us. And most of them in that industry have this antiquated product. And even though we show all of this value, they'll never switch. And it's all in this one industry, or it's all in this one subsection. And you find those tendencies which allow you to say, hey, that's a lot of, why would we ever spend another marketing dollar on that industry if we know they're never going to convert into a deal?
Oh, dog's barking in the background. I think that is an incredibly underutilized tactic right there, using outbound not just to book meetings and generate pipeline, but to learn, right? Not enough people treat outbound, like you say, as an acquisition channel, and they don't optimize for learning, right?
Right.
Could be incredibly valuable for early stage startups as well, right? If you truly don't have product market fit, this strategy right here is how you can find product market fit, how you can utilize your first sales hire to help you as a co-founder, or how you as a co-founder yourself can go out there, hit the market, hit the ground running, find product market fit.
It's a good and bad problem, because a lot of SDRs would say, hey, I want to control as many components. I want to write my own personal. How do I write better personalized messages? For an organization, it's actually a disadvantage though, because if you have a team of 12 SDRs and they're all writing their own messaging or making their own assumptions or testing their own hypothesis, it's actually, you're not gaining anything from an organization standpoint. Your SDR is getting more personal experience. And we've already learned, that the average life cycle of an SDR within an organization is, 10 to 14 months. So you're letting them get experience to move on to their next role where, hey, no, we should be doing things specific for our company and guided by our company. And that's where I would say that strategy SDR and the impression-based SDR, an organization should hire a mix between them. You don't want every SDR writing their own message or wanting to write their own message and doing their own testing, even though you got to kind of find that balance on how do you keep them motivated and still kind of doing their job. But if you launch 100 different Facebook ads to the same demographic, then you're really not going to learn anything or what was effective or non-effective.
Right. Here's a question that I have just from a team structure standpoint. You're talking about having a mix, a pod structure where you have some strategy-based SDRs, some more execution-focused, impression-based SDRs. Those strategists, do you recommend those be managers? Should they also have regular one-to-one meetings and be responsible for personal and professional development of their team? Or is that a whole separate role where you're a strategist and then we have a manager managing the strategist and the impression-based SDRs? I'm just imagining for the sales leaders on the line, how does that pod structure look usually?
Yeah, it's a tough question too. And I still think that's the one unknown that makes it difficult, because ideally you can have a strategist and a strategy-based SDR who's still running a good part of their own outbound campaigns as well. They're not just fully dedicated to strategy and understanding content and content writing. And this is where the SaaS industry and why companies like myself and so many are popping up, kind of like modern day marketing agency growth, is because it's expensive to have somebody who's specialized in content writing and then somebody else who just knows, hey, for your market, you're actually going to have a much lower conversion rate, because what we found is tendencies to do X, Y, Z, et cetera, et cetera. That's hard experience to gain if it's not fueled by somebody. Oftentimes, as you go VP or manager level, there's just different responsibilities, and that's where numbers just becomes your goal. Just get more conversions. It doesn't matter what the strategy is. So you got to find that fine mix for what's right in your organization. Do you want to invest in keeping somebody long-term? Then you would want a strategy-based SDR who's well-rounded, who understands each component of the acquisition channel. At the beginning stages, might be even executing as well, but maybe grows into a position where they lead 5 other SDRs, but they're coming up with the strategies and the implementations and the learnings and the data, as well as ensuring that quota is being met, right? But now you're reporting back on 2 different kind of analytics. One is our sales conversions, and then 2 is what have we learned about our market and our market size. And that leads into sales as well, which makes it even more confusing, is that if you're reaching out to segment A and you're booking 5x appointments with segment A, but sales comes back and says, yeah, but we can't close one of those into a closed one deal. And even though you're booking less meetings with this industry, we're actually closing 90% of those. So we actually prefer you to book us less meetings if it's just within this industry. So now the goal isn't always quota. It's not, hey, book me 15 appointments or book me 30 appointments. It's a more well-rounded funnel. And again, that's why companies like Leadium and others exist, is because we can provide that in a full outsourced agency kind of experience. And then that's why a lot of tech companies can invest high dollar, because they need to grow that. But it leaves a large mid-market kind of, where do we go? I need revenue today, but I also like the strategy, but I'm not experienced to run that strategy and do the outbound. If I hire an SDR, they're just going to know how to reach out without strategy. And so where do you go? And that's where the conversation should be on kind of the industry. It's why platforms like Outreach come out with more and more AI and logic, so you can kind of learn this through the function already.
Love that. Thank you, Kevin. Jenny, you're popular in the chat. People want to hear from you. The crowd wants to hear from you. Just so you guys know, we weren't ignoring Jenny the whole time, I promise. Jenny helped create all of this. So you've been hearing from Jenny the whole time. She helped.
And I've been furiously taking notes, talking to Kevin on the back end, all that good stuff. I'm background here.
Yeah, and so just so you guys know, and it's a good context at the end, because I kind of preface with, hey, I still write a majority of sequences we put out are still crossed through my desk and have a heavy hand in it from me. And as experienced as I am in writing sequences and running outbound programs, and et cetera. Jenny's our marketing director, so she runs all content development and marketing initiatives at Leadium. She will attest that not one of our clients sees a sequence until it's been proofread by 3 different people, and Jenny's one of those people. Because what sounds good to me, I just speak differently, and I use different types of grammar and English, and my high school English teacher screwed me from the start, because then college said, forget everything you learned. And so we actually put it through 3 different people to kind of proofread and edit and cut down, take out extra words. And I think that's forgotten a lot of times for SDRs as well.
Absolutely. Okay, it looks like we got 2 minutes left and we have 2 questions. They're basically the same question, and we actually already covered, I think, really the roots of what these questions are trying to get at. But Kevin, would you mind giving a quick recap? This is from Anonymous, and the second one is from Joanne Webb. Do you recommend sequencing by industry or job title before personalizing each message? And then the second part of that question is, couldn't you look on Indeed or other like job platform sites for certain types of job titles in a certain geography to see if that area is busy for the product or service you are selling? So essentially, like, let's just do a quick recap of how do you personalize, how do you create messaging that's relevant at scale?
Yeah, no, so it's great questions. And yes and no. So there's still logic you can go find. If your market tends itself to customization, then yes. I think my answer was, I can go to Indeed. I can see companies that are hiring sales development reps. My company outsources sales development reps, so I should reach out to them with my personalization. It will take longer to find that company, reach out, etc. The question becomes, does it drive a higher conversion rate? So I'm not saying don't personalize with kind of variables you can find, right? Alexa can say, we know your site traffic, or we know how much your marketing spend is. So I can find, hey, we know that you spent 10 million last quarter on marketing. We're a marketing optimization platform, yada, yada, yada. Yes, the question is that extra time has to be added into the cost per lead. So if you spent 2 hours doing it, your boss or your company's owner would say, hey, I'm paying you $20 an hour. That was $40 to find that extra piece of data. Did it actually convert in a higher number of appointments because my cost per appointment actually went up? And if you think about it like that, then you would say, well, let me test of not pulling that, but making the assumption. Meaning, if you know the majority of companies in the area are hiring that role, you no longer need to know that specific company is hiring the role. You can make the assumption and say, hey, Joan, I saw that the trend for Milwaukee is that you have a lot of new offices starting up. You have a sales development growth out there is crazy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you're making the assumption that because they're in Milwaukee and the majority of companies on Indeed are hiring for this position, that it's relevant to them, but you just took out all of the research time. The question is, does that drive the same amount of conversions? I forgot the first part or the second part of the question, but.
That was it. You nailed it. Yeah, just test your assumptions. The answer is like the ever frustrating, it depends. It just comes down to ABT, right? Not ABC, ABT, always be testing. Kevin, thank you so much for joining us, joining the community, sharing all your outbound wisdom. In community, thank you for showing up and investing 45 minutes, an hour with us today on this webinar. Hopefully it was valuable. We got a comment from Matt saying, thanks so much for a great session, really informative, made a lot of sense. Appreciate you, Kevin, sharing your wisdom. Amen. This was super valuable. And of course, Jenny, thank you so much for the help in organizing and prepping. These seed questions were fantastic. You are amazing.
Great job, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Kevin. Bye, guys.